Right. I know that the programme declares that you will now listen to me, but we thought when we discussed the order of the speakers it might be a good idea to have a change of voice for a little while. So I'm going to ask Dr. Margaret Sonmez, who teaches at METU, to come and present her paper on
dialect and authenticity.
Dialect and authenticity in Great Expectations. So please welcome Dr. Sonmez.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for asking me to join this event, which I've been very excited about. It's my first time talking at any sort of anniversary thing.
I need to just widget for my... What do you need to say?
Have you got it? Yes, I've got it. Does that work? Before I start the paper as such, I put on the PowerPoint slide 3 things that I thought went together quite well, but that don't have anything to do with my paper. I just wanted to share with you that when I was looking at the dialect that Dickens uses, I came across some interesting definitions that might make us think again when we read the novel. So, dialect and Great Expectations. The way people speak, in particular the distinctions between standard and non-standard speech, underscores major thematic patterns of Great Expectations and plays an important role in characterization too. At the same time, it subtly creates links and divisions between different pairs of characters. At the time of its writing, a very strong association between the speaker's speech and his or her social status already existed in England. Books about the language and etiquette guides all emphasised the importance of correct language and derided any sort of non-standard expressions or pronunciation. Also, in Dickens' lifetime, a newly developing interest in local and especially rural dialects reflected in a growing number of articles published and booklets written about them. At that time, they didn't use the word standard and non-standard. They seemed to use the word literary writing or literary English instead. Dickens was writing Great Expectations in the middle of a boom in such writings. In both the guides to correct usage and the dialect glossaries and grammars, local dialects were described in terms of authenticity or inauthenticity. As all the dialects featured in the novel, and at the 19th century books that I could find describing these dialects, and I want to share with you how Victorian ideas of speech and speakers, as authentic or inauthentic, bring out certain details of Dickens' characterization, including that of the narrator. Because there's not enough time to do the whole of the book here, I'm going to first of all explain the definitions and then look at the pair of characters, Jo and Margaret, before turning to paper and finishing my paper. In their writings about language, the Victorians showed conflicting attitudes towards dialect. One was to see rural dialects from remote districts as the purest and oldest forms of English, and thus as representing an authentic English, unsullied by imports from other places. This, in some writings, even took a very nationalistic turn. These dialects are thought of as being untouched by developments in the modern world and attractive to the nostalgia for a vanished past, which took many forms in the Victorian mind. Authenticity here is seen as an adherence to origins, and is approved of because what is oldest was somehow considered to be truest. In this view, speakers are vehicles for transmitting the ancient language through the generations, and the less contact they have with new or different ways of speaking, the purer and more authentic their language will be. Another way in which language and speakers could be designated as authentic was if they spoke consistently in the dialect of the environment to which they were deemed to belong by social origins, even if that dialect was neither ancient nor rural. This was seen as the natural language of the speaker, and some writers like Dickens would sometimes use non-standard speech to indicate the romantic notion of the basic honesty and goodness of the uneducated poor. For grammarians and dialectologists, however, only language, not honesty or goodness, counted, and any inconsistency was seen as a fault. Many excoriated the Cockney dialect as a mixture of different dialects, a sort of southeastern melting pot, and the new varieties emerging from the expanding industrial cities like Liverpool were not even considered to be proper dialects at all. This brings us to the last two definitions of inauthentic speech, as a use of a dialect that is no longer geographically pure or true to its social origins. Where features of one non-standard dialect were found to have intruded into another dialect, it was considered by Victorian dialectologists to have been corrupted. A number of writers about language even used the word polluted to refer to such mixed or changed dialects. So-called vulgar speech, on the other hand, showed its inconsistencies in an incomplete mastery of the socially prestigious standard dialect, so that either a local dialect is corrupted and vulgarized by attempts to elevate it through the uses of expressions taken from the prestige variety, or the speaker attempts to speak only in the prestige form but reveals his or her less pretentious linguistic origins by incorrect usages, slips and errors. When investigating the quoted speech of dialect speakers in this novel, according to these evaluations, their childhood backgrounds was revealed as a very important sub-thematic issue, which might seem obvious given the main plot of the novel, but is something that's not much discussed about secondary characters. Further, the narrator's attitudes towards his characters' use of dialect, and the way that the narrator manipulates shifts between direct and indirect reporting speech comes to the fore in such an investigation, and it is shown to be very sensitive, very sophisticated, and very revealing of the narrator's own character. It could even be claimed to be the most important way in which the older storytelling Pip is himself characterized by his own narrative. Let me now comment on his speech and authenticity in relation to German language before finishing off with Pip. Don't worry, there are very few slides, that is journalism with the slides that there are. These are my two main examples that I'm using of Joe's and Margaret's speech, Joe on the left, Margaret on the right. The speech of both Joe and Margaret is mostly reported directly in quotation marks like we have here. And this is happening to a degree that is exceptional in Dickens' writing. Many other authors have noted that he tends to intersperse direct and indirect reporting with a lot going into the indirect side. Some few of Joe's sentences are entirely in the standard dialect, and even fewer of Margaret's are too, and I've italicized them in this slide. But most, and certainly the sentences we remember, are very noticeably non-standard. With all of Dickens' dialect speakers, we find that dialect is represented by what has been called simplified deviance. That is, the messy reality of real-life speech is left out, but a fair number of non-standard elements are put into the framework of understandable sentences. We expect the non-standard features of any character's speech to reflect their local affiliations, which for Joe means the Kent in which he has lived since his earliest recorded memories. He has never had another home. He is an authentic local. Readers familiar with the local dialects would have found that Dickens's representation of Joe's dialect supports a Kentish origin, in spite of the fact that he uses relatively few of the many Kentish features that are listed in later 19th century descriptions of that dialect. Margaret, on the other hand, claims to have been a vagrant since infancy and to have no idea about where he comes from. Nevertheless, and in spite of many years in prison ships and in Australia, his speech habits are consistent with the place of his earliest memory, Essex. Next slide. Joe's dialect forms can mostly be found in the Kentish dialect, and Margaret's can mostly be found in the Essex dialect. Can you see the arrows? Yes, okay. They're very close to each other, as you can see. Kent is the top arrow and Essex is the bottom one. So, for example, when Joe says, lies didn't ought to come into Pip's mind, this didn't ought is very typical, according to the glossaries of the time, of Kentish speech, whereas Margaret's use of the word potatoes for potatoes and saying for four are both expressions frequently documented about speech of Essex. Almost none of their non-standard usages could not be found in the regions from which they're meant to come. Importantly, while Joe drops his H's quite often, this is something which is common in Kentish dialect, as you can see from the map. And indeed, it is found in most of England. Margaret, though, never drops a single H. And this is true exceptionally of the Essex dialects. This is a small piece which really I think Dickens must have somehow researched or noticed subconsciously by his wonderful poetic ear. Nevertheless, neither Jo's nor Margaret's speech is startlingly localised in any other way. The majority of the non-standard features in their speech are shared and commonly found in other parts of southern England. An important example of this is the non-standard forms of past tense verbs like see for saw, knowed for knew, done for did, and took for taken. I've got that here, I've got some signs, and give for given. Double and even triple negatives like don't never do it no more, or languages didn't you never think it might be me, and the use of uninflected adverbs like Jo saying repeatedly I'm awful dull instead of I'm awfully dull, or I live rough that you should live smooth, instead of I live roughly that you should live smoothly from language. Finally, while some of their more extraordinary departures from the standard are pure comedy, Jo's architectural is definitely one, acceptable, and language is rather poetic alliterative, phrases referring to himself, for example, when he says he was in danger of becoming a more than poorly mad sheep. Other of their stranger usages are actually reflecting genuine features of non-standard speech, such as Jo's reporting that his father died from a purple leptic fit. There's actually a reference to this sort of thing in Kent dialect dictionaries. To sum up, Jo is a completely authentic dialect speaker to the extent that he does not deviate from his non-standard speech pattern. As a character, he is presented as an authentic speaker who has never lived away from his own cut-off rural village. His Iron Age occupation, which associates him with pre-industrial England, combines with faithfulness in emotional attachments, routines, and repeated speech habits to create a reassuringly rock-like sense of an unchanging origin to which Pitt will relate in conflicting and agonistic ways, from which Pitt will have to separate himself if he is to develop, and which he will have to accept again if he is to mature fully, and to which he will only return when he is able to pay his debts with money made from abroad. Jo's verbal repetitions, and there are very many, and his own insistence upon repetition in his own life. Note the emphasis on old in the first quotation, implying unchanging life and character. The emphasis on Jo's unchangingness that he himself makes, both explicitly and implicitly, shows that it is just as important for Jo as it is for Pip to feel rooted, and it is very important for Pip that Jo should be rooted. And from this solid rootedness comes his overall sense of Victorian authenticity. Margaret's speech is perhaps surprisingly also consistent and true to his social and local origins. His speech characteristics conform closely, as we have seen, to the dialect of Essex. Like Jo, he does not mix his dialects, and he uses even fewer standard sentences than Jo, making him in this respect more of an authentic speaker than Jo. Dickens uses the same techniques for this character as he does for his other non-standard speakers. I'll just skip that bit. There are parallelisms between Margaret's speech and Jo's speech that remind us of certain parallelisms created by the plot. Both men seeing themselves in very different ways as surrogate fathers to Pip, both being condescended to by Pip, and Pip learning much from his shame about his behaviour towards them. Many of these characters' non-standard forms are shared, in fact, and in some cases this is because Kent and Essex are close together and do share a lot of dialectal features, and in other cases because these are general dialect features found all over the country. In terms of parallel usages, both of them use thank ye, both of them say fur for fall. Perhaps slightly pushing it a bit here, Jo consistently calls Pip dear chap, sometimes dear old chap, and Margaret repeatedly calls him dear boy, and sometimes my dear boy. Jo's repeated assertion that he is dreadful dull or awful dull has an echo in Margaret's repeated apologies for being low. Margaret does not know where he comes from, but his speech does. If we see the speech as reported retrospectively by a mature Pip, we may say that this narrator's consistent representation of the Essex dialect for this character is due either to an excellent memory or to a desire to give the character, for whom Pip does develop a deep affection and whose daughter he loves, the authenticity of recognisable, fixed and consistent speech habits. He is never anything other than a rough and unattractive convict whose crimes are so dreadful that he refuses to name them to Pip. But in the narrator's mind, he changes from a graveyard spectre of cannibalistic tendencies to a man whose approaching death brings to him so peaceful and patient an end as to be represented in dignified, indeed almost sanctified terms. Like Joe, he is unable to fit convincingly into any costume other than his own workaday clothes, and he is similarly unable or unwilling to disguise his speech. His consistent and authentic dialect distinguishes him from Compeyson, whose standard and educated language is at odds with his social environment, and whose crimes are all crimes of pretense. Giving Magwitch an authentic dialect allows him to be remembered by the narrator with a degree of dignity invested by integrity, and also presents him as a character type, the criminalised vagrant or varmint, that is by implication as much rooted in society as the unchanging and more fortunate figures like blacksmiths. In fact, it makes Magwitch the stylistic pair of Joe, for only these two characters in the novel speak so consistently and authentically in dialect and at such length. I would now hastily like to conclude by summarising how these representations of Joe and Magwitch's dialect speech reflect on the character of the mature and younger Pip. Narrating Pip, as we know, is just as much a character in the novel as the young Pip, but he does not describe himself directly as he does all the other characters. We build up a sense of this older Pip's character through the ways in which he describes the characters and events in his own history, and through his language, which is consistently a standard, or rather literally English. In fact, narrating Pip writes just like Dickens, and we tend to forget that there is a distinction between the two of them. One is fictional after all, the other historical. As I have tried to show, it seems important to narrating Pip that Joe should be an unchanging and totally reliable character, and this is reflected in the way he's remembered as speaking. That Joe is occasionally given completely standard sentences may be an unimportant detail or an oversight. Still, it does, curiously, present a reverse case of young Pip's dialect, which is reported as standard speech with only occasional slips into dialect words and sentences. Similarly, in giving Magwitch a dialect that is authentic in its consistency and local accuracy, narrating Pip is perhaps trying to make up his arrogant behaviour to returning Magwitch by depicting the older man as an authentic character, both in terms of his reported behaviour and of his speech. Narrating Pip works hard in the river and prison scenes to present to the readers a restituted Magwitch who is no longer either the terrible mud spectre of the marches nor the grotesquely comic figure of his early days in London. What, though, is the meaning of Pip's own highly standardised speech as a narrator and as reported throughout the whole novel with only 7 small slips into non-standard usages? A first implication is surely not so much that he's claiming authenticity for himself as authority. By taking complete control of the language of the privileged and educated elite, the narrating Pip shows that he has complete control over his own story and over all the other speakers in it. The man who can write phrases like, "The felicitous idea occurred to me," and "in pursuance of this luminous conception," is far from the poor, dazed village lad who, before he's moved to London, can still be found using local expressions like "keep company with Biddy," or "I don't know how you see me turning at it" for studying. And he's further still from the young child who wrote a letter indicating that he regularly dropped his H's and had all the other features of little speech. In fact, looking at the speech of very young Pip, one notices that most of it is indirectly reported, unlike Magwitch and Joe, in the voice of the narrating Pip, therefore. And even when the speech is directly reported, the older narrating Pip's voice creeps in, somewhat inappropriately, when Pip admits that he had lied about the velvet coach and the veal cutlets, and reveals that he has been made to feel his humble social position most cruelly. He tells Joe, "I am ignorant and backward," to which Joe responds, "Why, see what a letter you wrote last night, wrote in print even. I've seen letters, and from gentlefolks that I'll swear like wrote in print." And Pip says, "I have learned next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me. It's only that." The contrast between the two speakers here demonstrates the point. Little Pip is made to speak in narrating Pip's standard English. Furthermore, he is using older Pip's viewpoint too. However aware of his own educational shortcomings this child was, those same shortcomings would have rendered him unable to express himself in the words that he's shown us using. The incongruity between the child's perception and the often exaggeratedly learned sentences that he used to report them is a characteristic feature of Dickens' style, and I think he's actually parodying the style of the narrating Pip on some occasions. Yes, I've got 5 lines left.
Sorry.
Very young Pip's perceptions take on the maturity of the narrator's words. Another effect is that very young Pip appears to have always been able to express himself in an adult way, and the standard speech that is reported from his years later does not then appear to be at odds with an earlier dialect. Dr. Kennedy mentioned that in Tomlin's biography, Dickens was considered to be too mixed to be a gentleman. This is the same idea of mixed dialect, the idea that authenticity and sticking to one's origin is what's required. Young Pip, when he came to London, should have had elocution lessons. He should have been working hard on his language. There is so much evidence that this and clothes and language, the two things that the aspiring social riser had to change. And neither of these things are ever, not even once mentioned in the novel. Pip seems to suddenly transform himself into a standard speaking, a beautifully dressed, elegant young man without the slightest effort, which would not have happened. And I think narrating Pip simply doesn't want to show himself as a vulgar and corrupt speaker or a vulgar and corrupt dresser for that matter. Thank you very much.
And my title is Maladies of Food and Starvation, A Christmas Carol in the Hungry 40s. By 2012, Charles Dickens and Christmas seemed to be almost symbiotically intertwined. Dickens was associated himself with Christmas from a very early point in his career. In the 1836 preface to the second edition, to the second series of the sketches by Boz, he wishes, I quote, his best friend, the public, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. From 1843 to 1848, he published a series of Christmas books, of which A Christmas Carol is the best known and also by far the best. From 1852 to 1867, he always published a special Christmas number in the two journals of which he was the editor. As Michael Slater says, Dickens tapped into, I quote, a great revival of interest in traditional English Christmas customs and festivities that had been in progress since the beginning of the 19th century. Still, today, in England, Britain and elsewhere, Dickens is routinely associated with Christmas. Films of A Christmas Carol and some of his other novels are regularly shown at Christmas time and indeed at other times of the year. And both the family and food are staple elements of these fictional and film celebrations of Christmas, and indeed of A Christmas Carol. Paradoxically, however, Tara Moore identifies A Christmas Carol as an example of something called Victorian starvation literature, associated with Christmas. For many Victorian writers, including Dickens, Christmas was a time for reminding the middle classes of their responsibility to help the poor, especially in the decade known as the Hungry 40s, and for warning them of the dangers which may lie in wait for them if the poor were not helped. A Christmas Carol reveals three themes which are central to Dickens' fiction: the contrast between the idealized and the dysfunctional family, the demand for respect, sympathy, and help for the poor and neglected, and the dangers these same poor and neglected might represent if they were not helped. In this paper, I will look first at Dickens' celebration of the family and of food in A Christmas Carol. Then at the elements in the book which undermine these celebratory images: the crippled Tiny Tim, the two allegorical children, ignorance and want, and the novel's warnings about the threat they represent to society. Finally, I shall suggest that Dickens' novel may appease its audience's possible feelings of guilt about Christmas overindulgence in the face of starvation and deprivation, as more notes, but offers only the actions of a benevolent individual Scrooge rather than any more systematic solution. A Christmas Carol glories in the descriptions of food and drink. At Fezziwig's Christmas party, at the Cratchits' and Fred's Christmas dinners, in the grocer's shops on Christmas Eve. For reasons of time, I will focus on only one of them, the narrator's representation of the Christmas dinner at Bob Cratchit's house, where the preparation and serving of the food are a matter of cooperation. All the family participate, as the narrator shows, and I quote, "Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and, mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" The description celebrates cooperation and the excitement of the occasion as well as the food, and as the images of the black swan and the two young Cratchits sticking their spoons into their mouths to stop themselves screaming for goose reveal eating meat is not an everyday event in this family. The passage not only celebrates food and family unity, it also gives a moral message. When Bob Cratchit praises his wife's Christmas pudding, the narrator comments, "Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to say so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing." Moreover, when Mrs. Cratchit says of the goose, with great delight, that they hadn't ate it all at last, the narrator points out that all that's left of the bird is one small atom of bone upon the dish. In fact, there is barely enough pudding or meat for all the family. These details seem at first only to add to the idealization of the Cratchit family. However, if we remember that A Christmas Carol was published for Christmas 1843, in the decade which came to be known as the Hungry 40s, the inadequate food takes on a somewhat different meaning. In 1839, there was an economic depression caused by a slump in trade and accompanied by bad harvests, which continued for the next 2 years. As Claire Tomlin says, the 1840s were a time of recession and severe hardship in England. This was partly because until 1846, the Corn Laws kept the price of wheat unnaturally high and prevented the import of foreign wheat. Thus, the two staple foodstuffs of the poor, one of the two staple foodstuffs of the poor, bread, was hard to find or too expensive for working people to buy. Seen in this context, Dickens' narrator's insistence on the Cratchit family's refusal to complain about their inadequate food not only idealizes the family, but also softens the suggestion of malnutrition, which the scarcity of food implies, and which is seen in Tiny Tim's condition. For Tiny Tim is crippled. He has a little crutch, and his limbs are supported by an iron frame. Although the narrator does not identify Tiny Tim's crippled state as rickets, a disease which results largely from malnutrition, it seems quite likely that it is. If nothing changes, as the ghost of Christmas present assures Scrooge, Tiny Tim will die. The Cratchits endure poverty and hunger uncomplainingly, and therefore they can be safely pitied and patronised. By the end of the story, due to Scrooge's conversion and his subsequent interest in the Cratchit family, Tiny Tim does not die, thanks to the fact that Scrooge becomes a second father to him. Despite this happy ending, though, even at the heart of the idealised family Christmas celebrations of food and happiness, there are suggestions of hunger, malnutrition, and disease. But of course, the novel gives a much more explicit warning about the effects of a lack of family and of food on individuals and on society in the two children, Ignorance and Want, who are hidden under the robe of the spirit of Christmas present. They're described like this. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out, menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, through all the mysteries of wonderful creation, has monsters half so horrible and dread. These children are the opposite of Wordsworth's potentially angelic vision of the child as trailing clouds of glory and coming from God, who's our home. They are not angels, but devils. When Scrooge asks, "Spirit, are they yours?" the ghost replies, "They are man's. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." When, horrified, Scrooge asks, "Have they no refuge or resource?" the ghost responds by quoting the words with which Scrooge replied to the benevolent gentleman's request for money to help the poor. "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" As with the Cratchits, the moral lesson is clear. It's the irresponsibility and negligence of people like Scrooge, who embody the economic and political philosophy of laissez-faire, which both Dickens and Carlyle, among others, excoriated in their writings, and which causes the neglect of the poor and their children, a neglect which might in future lead to doom, or in other words, social unrest, riots, or even revolution. Dickens was not alone in warning of the dangers represented by a neglected, hungry, and oppressed working class. Thomas Carlyle declares in Chartism that there is a general feeling that something ought to be done about the condition of the working classes, and that if something be not done, something will do itself one day and in a fashion that will please nobody. Engels, in the final chapter of The Condition of the Working Class in England, claims that the war of the poor against the rich will become direct and universal. It is too late for a peaceful solution. Similarly, in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels see Europe as haunted by the spectre of communism and argue that in producing workers who are too poor to survive in the capitalist system, the bourgeoisie produces its own grave diggers, because the same workers will one day rise up and destroy it. To conclude, although A Christmas Carol generally offers celebratory pictures of both biological and alternative extended families, the Cratchits and Scrooge's nephew's family, as well as Fezziwig's family, which includes both his own family and those who work for him, the story nonetheless contains warnings about children without families and families without food. As a solution to these problems, Dickens proposes individual paternalism and philanthropy. Scrooge becomes Tiny Tim's second father. He donates a large sum of money to the gentleman collecting money for the poor. As Moore notes, A Christmas Carol was much less explicit than other examples of Victorian Christmas starvation texts. In depicting the threat of starvation in the midst of plenty, Dickens is content to suggest that Scrooge changes for the better, and that his change will affect not just the Cratchit family, but potentially at least the whole society. As Dickens says in his 1849 preface to Martin Chuzzlewit, 7 years after the publication of A Christmas Carol, what is substantially true of families is true of a whole commonwealth. As we sow, we reap. Unfortunately, as Dickens' later novels show, neither the family nor the Victorian Commonwealth was altogether in a healthy state, and Dickens never stopped telling his audience that it wasn't. Thank you.
I have a handout. I'll pass that around. Thank you very much. You're going to find long quotations on the handout, and we will go over all of those quotations together, and we'll have enough time for that. So I hope you will enjoy the long quotations. I know they're long, but we will take a look at them together. Most of you have them at this point, so why don't I get started? My paper today is titled Autonomy in Economics and Gender Ideology, The Cases of Dickens's Bounderby and Pip. I'm going to talk about dreams of self-reliance in Victorian England. The ideal of self-reliance compelled individuals to boast of their prosperity, as if they owed it all to themselves. National wealth was subject to the same set of rules. The fantasy that the nation owed its wealth to the hard work of its members and to no one else blatantly disregarded the role that the colonies played in Britain's economic rise in the 19th century. Charles Dickens treated the fantasy of self-reliance as nothing but that, a fantasy, an injurious and misinformed fantasy. Through brief readings of Hard Times and Great Expectations, today I will suggest that Dickens's critique of self-reliance develops through the metaphor of the family. My paper grows out of my long-term interest in how economic thought deploys the language of gender in the 19th century during the rise of the global capitalist free market. Section 1. The Self-Made Man and His Mother. Mr. Bounderby, a wealthy factory owner in Charles Dickens's Hard Times, is a proud man. Of all things, he is most proud of not having a caring mother. Now, having his mother abandon him when he was little, why would he be proud of that? Let's turn to an excerpt from Hard Times to find out. Here, Mr. Bounderby talks to his friend Mr. Gradgrind's wife. And this is going to be quotation number 1 on the handout. "How I fought through it, I don't know," said Bounderby. "I was determined, I suppose. I have been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then. Here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and nobody to thank for my being here but myself." Mrs. Gradgrind meekly and weakly hoped that his mother, "My mother? Bolted, ma'am," said Bounderby. Mrs. Gradgrind, stunned as usual, collapsed and gave it up. "My mother left me to my grandmother," said Bounderby, "and, according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and the worst old woman that ever lived. If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she would take 'em off and sell 'em for drink." Mr. Bounderby boasts of not having had a mother and a drunkard for a grandfather because all of this proves that he is self-sufficient. In his view, everything he has achieved, he has done so single-handedly. Nobody ever helped him. In fantasizing about self-reliance, Mr. Bounderby echoes an ideal that became popular in Victorian England, that of the self-made man. And I'm using the gendered language deliberately here, and we'll talk more about that. The author Samuel Smiles, for example, famously articulated that ideal in his interminable volume titled Self-Help. Smiles opens his book with the claim that only those people who receive no help from others will be successful. And this is going to be quotation number 2 on the handout. The spirit of self-help is the root of all genuine growth in the individual, and exhibited in the lives of many, it constitutes the true source of national vigor and strength. Help from without is often enfeebling in its effects, but help from within invariably invigorates. In these opening lines, Samuel writes of the individual, divested of all social connection in an imaginary vacuum. He looks down upon collaboration, upon all those acts where one subject helps another to grow and to achieve his or her own goals. In his view, connections between people weaken them. If you're thinking that what Smiles is saying here contradicts everything that they teach us, let's say in kindergarten, you're right. They do, indeed, this is the case. Oddly enough, Smiles' ideas remain common enough today under the neoliberal regime that challenges the welfare state. For example, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, then Prime Minister, infamously echoed Smiles, saying, "There is no such thing as society." I haven't seen the recent film about Margaret Thatcher, but I suspect this line must be quoted in the film, and if anyone's seen the film, you should let me know during the break. Through the fictional character of Bounderby, Dickens satirizes the individualist urge to deny what one owes to society and to one's family. For the Victorians, the self-made individual epitomized masculinity. Traditional gender roles in the period assigned to women the altruistic role of the caring mother or the caring sister. Indeed, Dickens himself often characterized women along these lines in his own novels. From Amy Dorrit to Florence Dombey, many of his female protagonists selflessly love selfish men. If the social role that mainstream gender ideology assigned to women was that of the self-sacrificing angel, Dickens capitalized fully on that role as a source of sentimental appeal in his work. But how could mainstream Victorian culture at once valorize the self-made man and the figure of the self-sacrificing woman who makes the man's comfort possible? To be a self-made individual, wouldn't one have to deny the support of loving mothers, sisters, and wives? It is this tension between the valorization of care and the individualism of the self-made man that Dickens articulates through the character of Bounderby. In Self-Help, Smiles does not just undervalue interpersonal connection. He denies its existence. Offering example after example, he idolizes individuals who succeed in the world all on their own, as if such a thing were possible. In Hard Times, Dickens reveals the hypocrisy of such dreams of self-reliance. For all his boasting, Mr. Bounderby is not quite the self-made man he would like to be, as we find out when his mother shows up. And this is going to be quotation number 3 on the handout. "I am surprised, madame," said Mr. Gradgrind, Bounderby's friend, observed with severity, "that in your old age you have the face to claim Mr. Bounderby for your son after your unnatural and inhuman treatment of him." "Me unnatural?" cried poor old Mrs. Pegler. "Me inhuman? To my dear boy?" "Dear," repeated Mr. Gradgrind. "Yes, dear in his self-made prosperity, madame, I dare say. Not very dear, however, when you deserted him in his infancy and left him to the brutality of his drunken grandmother." "I deserted my Josiah," cried Mrs. Pegler, clasping her hands. She was so very earnest and injured that Mr. Gradgrind, shocked by the possibility which dawned upon him, said in a gentler tone, "Do you deny, then, madame, that you left your son to be brought up in the gutter?" "Josiah in the gutter!" exclaimed Mrs. Pegler. "No such a thing, sir, never. For shame on you. My dear boy knows, and will give you to know, that though he come of humble parents, he come of parents that loved him as dear as the best could, and never thought it hardship on themselves to pinch a bit that he might write and cipher beautiful, and I've his books at home to show it." Now, of course, I'm thinking about dialect in this quotation, but anyway. For Dickens, self-reliance is nothing but a myth. Note, however, that his critique of the claim to self-reliance holds up a very traditional gender ideology, where a woman matters because she cares for others. The critique of self-reliance, then, sinks all too easily into the vortex of imposing and restrictive gender roles. Section number 2 is shorter, the self-made man and the nation. Now let's briefly go back to the opening lines of Smile's self-help that we've read together to think about how the ideal of self-reliance impacts nationhood. He wrote, "The spirit of self-help is the true source of national vigor and strength." The relation between the self-made individual and the vigor of the nation is indexical. In other words, it concerns the relation of the part to the whole. The nation, in this view, is nothing but a conglomerate of individuals. If the parts that make up the whole are strong, then the whole will be strong. However, the relation between national strength and self-help is not only indexical in Victorian culture. The self-made man also provides a metaphor on which dreams of national power are based. Could the nation also be self-sufficient? Just like a self-made man, could the nation claim to have accumulated wealth all on its own without relying on external entities, on foreign peoples? For many who boasted of the affluence of the English middle class in the Victorian period, the answer was in the affirmative. Yes, it could. The longing for self-reliance marks the language of economic exploitation. The very language that described colonial ties betrays the desire to suppress the benefits that Britain accrued through colonization. The word dependency, which denoted a subordinate place or territory, especially a country or province subject to the control of another, reflects the imperialist ideology according to which colonized territories depended on the metropole for commercial and technological advancement, as well as moral and intellectual guidance. Victorians who championed colonialism depicted the colony as a child and the metropole as her parent. This metaphor, suggesting that the colony needed the colonizing power to grow, sought to justify Britain's control over the colonies. Britain as the parent. The metaphor disregards, and indeed hides, the extent to which Britain relied on the colonies for its own growth. The colony has a mother, but, like Mr. Bounderby, the colonizer seems to lack one. If Britain became the center of the global capitalist economy in the 19th century, it did so with the help of profits accrued in the colonies. And this is the point that I'm going to come back to in my very brief reading of Great Expectations. And in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip the fourth quotation that you have on the handout and just move on to my reading of Great Expectations. What the term dependency conceals, that is, profits accrued in the metropole through colonial tribute, loomed large in the public conscience, surfacing not only in economic writing centering on national wealth, but also in fictional narratives that assessed moral character and social respectability. Like many other Victorian intellectuals at that time, novelists questioned the moral dimension of what the state was doing in the colonies. In a moment, I will propose that Great Expectations draws attention to the nation's dependence on the colonies. Great Expectations, as many of you know, is about a boy who is not at all self-made. Not that he, that is Pip, minds that. You see, the ideal of self-reliance is a markedly bourgeois one, held up by the likes of Mr. Bounderby, who own factories or small-scale businesses. Pip, on the other hand, dreams of becoming a gentleman, a man with an aristocratic life, who never has to work for his bread. He comes close to achieving his dream when a secret benefactor makes a large sum of money available to him. But who is helping him? In other words, what is the source of his wealth? For as long as he thinks that his money is coming from Miss Havisham, the wealthy woman who lives in a mansion close by, he is satisfied. When he finds out that the source of his money is a convict who made a fortune in one of England's white settler colonies, Australia, he experiences a crisis. At this point, I'm going to make a claim that may sound unintuitive at first. The convict's sudden arrival in Pip's apartment in Great Expectations, I'm going to say, parallels Bounderby's mother's appearance in Hard Times. I make this claim even though the differences between the two situations are obvious. Unlike Bounderby, Pip never claims to be a self-made man. Given his penchant for an aristocratic life, it's safe to assume that Pip would actually hate to be a self-made man. Why then am I suggesting that there's a parallel? In the case of Great Expectations, the convict threatens to reveal the imagined self-reliance of the nation to be a myth. Just as Pip's prosperity depends on the riches of someone else, the nation's wealth is derived from an external entity. Figuratively, the convict is like the mother whose assistance Bounderby denies. Even though the colonies make metropolitan wealth possible, the colonizing power is reluctant to admit that. This reading of Great Expectations, where Pip's dependence on the convict from Australia indexes England's reliance on the colonies, is not my own. But what I personally would like to draw attention to is the capaciousness of Dickens' critique of self-reliance and how he relies on the figure of the family to articulate it. Hard Times and Great Expectations together display that for Dickens, neither individuals nor the collective entity that they comprise can be self-reliant. When Pip finds in his convict the paternal support he always lacked, the common identification of the metropole as the parent dissolves. The parent figure is unmistakably colonial, but only temporarily so. The convict must die as if to spare Pip from a burden. Pip, in the end, comes into his own and achieves the status of the man without a parental figure, a status that Bounderby can only dream of. Thank you. And I also would like to very briefly introduce our next speaker, Alev Karaduman, Assistant Professor at the Department of English Language and Literature at Hacettepe University. Dr. Karaduman has published journal articles and a book-length study on Dickens fiction. Her paper today is titled Dickens and the Concept of Family in Oliver Twist.
As the last speaker of today, before beginning to my speech, I would like to state that I really feel privileged to be with you in this cozy atmosphere on the Dickensian day, and I would like to present my deepest gratitude to Professor Dr. Talat Hanman, the Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Gül Kurtuluş, Dr. Valerie Kennedy, and Ayse Celikkol, and to you all, to the students who have put their hearts to prepare this day. And my title of the speech today is Dickens and the Concept of Family in Oliver Twist. Okay. Charles John Hugham Dickens, with his longest name, who is accepted as one of the most influential authors of not only the Victorian but also the world literature, is a novelist who deals with every single social issue in his novels, and especially put emphasis on the concept and importance of family in his era. Almost all in his novels quote analysis of the family and its relations to wider social forms has occupied an important place. As the middle-class family in the Victorian era was considered to be the primarily nuclear structure. Thus, the major aim of this paper is to analyze the importance of the concept of family in Oliver Twist. But before dealing with Oliver Twist, we have to define the meaning of family from the sociological point of view first. What is the meaning of family sociologically? Raymond Williams, in his study, Keywords, a Vocabulary of Culture and Society, makes a deep analysis of the world and states that, in the beginning of the sociological studies, family is described as, quote, a kin group, often equivalent to a tribe, unquote. However, between the 17th and the 19th centuries, there is a specialization of the term to describe, quote, a small kinship sharing the same household. Thus, the term tribe leaves its place to the household. Then, in the same work, Williams quotes an early 19th century definition by James Mill, who stated that the group which consists of a father, a mother, and children is called a family. What about the concept of family in the Victorian era? The concept of family in the Victorian period can be traced in the 1851 Consensus Report. The family was taken to be the basic social unit in the census, consisting of a head and of dependent members, as you see in the picture, living together in the same dwelling. Thus, the 19th century specialization of the term family is to describe the small kinship group occupying a single house. In other words, formation of the shared notion of family life in the Victorian era was based on a close kinship with a male breadwinner, self-sacrificing wife, and obedient children. Thus, the house became both the setting and the symbol of the Victorian family. In the 19th century, a normative definition of the family was needed to be formulated. In order to establish this notion of family magazines were used not only to educate but also to establish the moral values of the domestic issues of the Victorian period. As John Shattuck and Michael Wolff pointed out, quote, the overwhelming popular family magazines provided a wide range of readers from the middle classes with common fund of images, information, attitudes and values associated with the celebration of home and family life. The family magazines included the cheap periodicals like the Family Economist, Family Friend, Household Words, the London Journal, the Magazine of Domestic Economy, and magazine Family Herald and Eliza Cook's Journal. They were the most famous family magazines, which were highly appreciated by the Victorian middle class audience. The family magazines owed their popularity to their effort to cater for every income and taste. The motto of the Family Herald was, quote, "Interesting to all, offensive to none." They were cheap, very cheap, and domesticated in many thousand families. They were created for a range of readers, differentiated by class, gender, generation, and locality. Fictional tales, poetry, informational articles, advice about gardening, household matters, recipes, puzzles, and riddles were the major topics of the magazines. Thus, it is not wrong to state that the aims of those magazines were to idealize the family life, putting emphasis on the social position and economic value. Women's domestic responsibilities, female and male identities within the family, propagation of home values were the other issues used to pursue the cultural formation. One of the most important functions of the magazines was to provide a cultural milieu from which the serial novel emerged, and in turn the original part issues of Dickens's novels often contained advertisements for various journals devoted to the family. With respect to the novel, the representation of family was regarded as a Dickensian specialization. A reviewer of Fraser's magazine praises the Dickens's talents of creating a friendly atmosphere in David Copperfield, stating that, quote, "There is no fireside in the kingdom where the cunning fellow has not contrived to secure a corner for himself as one of the dearest and by this time one of the oldest friends of a family," unquote. He attributes to Dickens's, quote, "enthusiastic talent of household goods," unquote. In an 1855 review of Blackwood's, Margaret Oliphant, as the preeminent novelist of the middle-class family, also praises Dickens. She says, she quote, "The middle class in itself a realm of indefinite gradations, but nowhere does the household heart burn brighter. Nowhere is the family love so warm, the natural bond so strong, and this is the ground which Mr. Dickens occupies per excellence, the field of triumphs from which he may defy all his rivals without fear," unquote. Similarly, an article in a Saturday Review notes Dickens's respect for the, quote, "sanctity of home and goodness of women," while another commentator remarks that, quote, "his sympathy with the affections of heart and the home knows no bounds," unquote. On the other hand, Dickens's reputation as the purveyor of cozy domestic atmosphere to be at the odds with relatively small number of happy and harmonious families depicted in his fiction. Dickens's continuing interest in the relationship of public and private life between the market and home put emphasis on the role of family in his early novels. For example, in Nicholas Nickleby and Dombey and Son, he wrote about the function of family within the economic sufferings as a result of industrialization. In his Little Dorrit and Our Mutual Friend, he drew the attention to the readers to the decaying homes and appalling families. His later novels did not represent his idealization of happy but fragmented and fractured families. At least one parent is missing, creating an opportunity in his fiction for the formation of a variety at typical familiar relationship together with a host of a hero or a heroine to solve, and clearly the figure of an orphan has been a particular source to show the corruption of society and to put emphasis on the importance of a having family in society. Orphans' lack of family became a way of exploring a kind of anxiety in the Victorian age. One of his earlier novels, Oliver Twist, tells the story of an orphan's progress from poverty and anonymity to the relation of his pedigree and recovery of his inheritance. It's a novel about the hero's retrieval of his lost family origins, about the discovery of his identity and social position through the recovery of his birthright. Oliver, being brought up in cruel institutions like workhouses, could hardly be expected to have the concept of home, but this is not presented as a problem in the novel. From the beginning of the novel, Oliver's speech and face displays his patrimony, but his clothes and companions might seem to mark him as a criminal. As a number of critics state, Oliver's good English accent is a sign both of his innate goodness and also of his birth, which will later on define his moral and social position in the society. Despite having been born and bred in workhouse, Oliver shared the language of Brownlows and Malays rather than the corrupted speech of his early associates, Mr. Bumble, Noah Claypole, and Fagin. Similarly, his face is a sign of his true moral and social status. The embodiment of truth in Oliver's face works to naturalize his social position by linking the evidence of hidden family origin. It is highly significant for the politics of the family in his novel that his innate goodness and his genealogy were written on his face to legitimate his middle-class origin. As a narrative about recovery of his origins, the novel draws upon an aristocratic conception of a family as a lineage. This is the form of family that defines itself in terms of blood relatedness. It is not surprising to find out that his legitimacy is found by invoking a notion of aristocratic family. But what he recovers by these means is a position that embraces the domestic ideal. An aristocratic conception of the family is used to establish Oliver's place in the world of middle-class respectability. His story provides a fable of identity for the newly risen middle class, a myth of origins that should serve to strengthen their sense of social legitimacy. However, despite the importance of genealogy in securing Oliver's personal and social identity, the family that is reconstituted at the end of the book, Oliver discovers that Rose Maylie is his aunt, but rejects his relationship and insists on regarding Rose as a quasi-sister. "Not aunt," cried Oliver, throwing his arms about her neck. "I will never call her aunt. Sister, my own sister, that something taught my heart to love so dearly from the first. Rose, dear Rose," he says. Mr. Bournelow adopts Oliver as his son and removes with him, and Mrs. Badwin, who, like Mrs. Maylie, has acted as a surrogate mother to Oliver throughout, to within a mile of Personage House, where Rose and Harry Maylie live. In narrator's word, Oliver, quote, thus linked together a little society whose condition approached as nearly to one of the perfect happiness can ever be known in this changing world, unquote. The emphasis on this surrogate familiar relationships and the cozy harmony of the little society indicate that the family has been reconstructed according to the Victorian middle class ideal of domesticity. In this way, Oliver Twist, as the novel, shows evidence of the competing definitions of the family available in the Victorian age. It is Oliver's illegitimacy which causes his initial plight and subsequent misadventures, and which is responsible for bringing such respectable members of the middle classes as Mr. Brownlow into contact with London underworld. In the underworld, Faggin's Den offers the most notable parody of the middle-class family in the novel. It is represented as the place of menace, in contrast to the cozy atmosphere of the domestic life of the Victorian family life. Oliver is introduced to Faggin's family by the artful Dodger. Faggin's place, is the parody of the Victorian domesticity. Fagin cooks the evening meal, surrounded by the household utensils and a crowd of hungry boys. Faggin's place appears to offer the comfort and coziness code held to be provided by the Victorian class family circle. Fagin offers the patriarchal figure over the boys in his charge. He controls the cash gained from the fencing the stolen goods by the goods they bring in. Remarkably, Fagin combines the paternal exercise of paternal discipline with the maternal duties of the homemaker. He is the one who cooks meal, arranges accommodation, educates his pupils and plays with them. The tendency to combine aspects of the maternal and paternal roles defined by the middle-class ideology of the family contributes to the mixed gender positions involved in Fagin's portrayal. In contrast to the parodic family formed by the criminal underworld, the novel sets for an alternative realm of the middle-class domesticity that is located in the homes of Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Maylie. Significantly, the opposition is highlighted by Rose as the foil in narrative. The representation of the female identity is an integral part of ideology of the family. Clearly, Rose Maylie exemplifies the virtues of domestic angel code. The very intelligence that's shown in her deep blue eyes and was stamped upon her noble head seemed scarcely of her age or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good manner. The thousand lights that played about the face and left no shadow there. Above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were meant for home and fireside peace and happiness. The evidence of Rose's domestic virtue is part of Dickens's argument about natural innocence and the rejection of social and legal legitimacy. It's also a crucial factor in establishing the boundary between the underworld and the world of middle class. There are many other examples and issues to be emphasized in the novel in relation to family issues, but because of the limitation of time, I have to come to a conclusion and state that Dickens, being aware of the class-conscious society of his own time and country, tries to put emphasis on having a socially accepted and identified family and family relations in order to have a safe and secure place in society, which gives importance to middle-class principles. I just tried to open some guidelines to you how Dickens analyzed the concept of family from different points of view. Thank you very much.
Now, maybe we can spare just a few minutes in case someone would like to have a question, and then we'll go out and have our coffee break and come back for the round table. So for now, just a few minutes. Does anyone have a question?
for Margaret and Valerie, I'm wondering, I'm doing the Scrooge thing later on, and I noticed that thank ye was in your list, Margaret. And it also was the first word that was projected up when you started your paper there, Val. But in any case, you do know, though, that Scrooge at a certain point says thank ye. And I, at least in my script, I'm not remembering any other instance where Scrooge's speech is at all dialect marked. So what exactly is the status of thank ye? Is it so general that that it doesn't indicate any kind of regional affiliation, or where exactly does it fit in? Like, why does Scrooge say thank ye?
They all do. They all do it time to time. In David Copperfield, in Nicholas Nickleby, most of the characters in Great Expectations, the one I've been looking at recently, there was a little sleight of hand there. I mean, these would have been considered non-standard for literary language, but quite acceptable informal usages. Actually, thank ye seems to be used by just about everybody. Not Miss Havisham. I think it was an informal, I haven't checked for gender, it might have been something that men used more. There's also the word halloa that seems to be, for example, Herbert Pocket, who has been well brought up young man, he says thank ye in Great Expectations too. So I think we can see it like the use of M for them as being a fairly normal, informal usage. But if you didn't know anything else, then it would become non-standard. So you would say thank ye when you were informal, talking to your friends or feeling relaxed, but you wouldn't say that when you were meeting somebody who was, very, very important. Then you would have to say thank you, I think, but I haven't studied it. But I'm not surprised that he uses that, and he probably says ain't from time to time and and stuff like that, because these words are kind of only sometimes non-standard. They're actually more to do with formality of speech register than whether or not you're a dialect speaker.
I would just add that I don't know. This is really sort of an answer to a question from Margaret. To me, there's a connotation of warmth as well as informality.
Yeah, I think that works.
Of friendliness and warmth rather than thank you being more formal doesn't suggest this interpersonal relationship.
Yeah. Well, Scrooge is antagonistic with almost everybody he dialogues with, except that there's that, he says thank you in that moment where he's talking to Jacob Marley, who's interceded for him with the powers, as it were.
That's right. So
he says, you've always been a good friend, thank you.
That would support my argument about friendship and warmth, I guess.
Yeah.
So you know the text more extensively, though. I mean, does Scrooge ever sink into any kind of informal speech patterns elsewhere?
No, I don't think so.
Pretty well a singular instance? That thank you, I mean?
I can't think, off the top of my head, I can't think of many examples.
Actually, it would be nice to see whether he changes at the end of the novel, whether his language becomes less rigid at the end of the thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure is the honest answer to that.
All right, in the interest of time, we will conclude the panel now, and when we come back for the roundtable, we'll have a chance to revisit some of these texts that we've been talking about.